Before there were YouTube channels dedicated to roller coasters, before there was a comprehensive online database cataloging nearly every roller coaster to have ever existed, even before there were books on the subject, there was Dr. Robert Cartmell. A professor emeritus of art at the University of Albany in New York, he was an excellent painter and printmaker, known for his abstract expressionist style, but he's perhaps most well known as a coaster enthusiast and researcher, and is generally recognized as the first renowned authority on roller coasters. In 1974, as the coaster boom of the 1970s was in full swing, Professor Cartmell penned a New York Times article entitled The Quest for the Ultimate Roller Coaster. The article touched on many aspects of coasterdom, focusing not only on the history of roller coasters, but their historical impact and legacy. The article struck a chord with countless readers, many of whom wrote in to share their passion and love for these amazing rides. The article concluded with Robert Cartmell's personal top 10 list, which would go on to influence coaster opinion for years to come. In a world saturated with top 10 lists, I thought it'd be interesting to explore one of the very first, seeing if any coasters surprisingly missed the cut, and checking out how these coasters stack up today. I'll be using two polls to gauge how the coaster community feels about these rides today. The first being Mitch Hawker's Best Roller Coaster poll, the poll that set the gold standard on how to rank coasters. Unfortunately, this poll was last conducted in 2013, so I'll also be looking at the results of CoasterBot's 2020 Vote Coasters poll, a poll that uses a similar methodology and ranking system. Feel free to check out the link to both polls in the description. Without further ado, let's dive into the list. Yeah, keep in mind that a lot has changed in the nearly 50 years since this list was created. Undeniably a classic, this Edward A. Vettel design ride opened in 1940, a mere 1 year before the United States became involved in World War II. Dr. Cartmell praised the ride as a twisting thriller with diabolically placed turns and banks. Lakeside Cyclone is indeed a rather unique wooden coaster. The ride begins as a true twister, with unbanked sections of track being nearly non-existent, before finishing with a turnaround and a series of camelback hills more akin to something you'd see on an out-and-back coaster. The ride's location in the Rockies and proximity to the park's namesake lake also seem to influence its placement on the list, as Cartmell makes sure to mention the ride's spectacular scenery. Today, Lakeside Cyclone is still held in decent regard, but is certainly not top 10 worthy. In the 2013 Mitch Hawker coaster poll, which looked only at wooden coasters, it placed 59th in the world. On CoasterBot's 2020 coaster poll, it ranked 620th amongst all coasters, wood and steel. However, it's worth noting that out of 2,700 submissions, only 10 of those had Lakeside Cyclone on their list, not only meaning that it is very underridden by enthusiasts, but also, by the nature of how the poll is conducted, could influence its spot on the list by drastically lowering its ranking. Another classic, although I guess all of the coasters on this list could be considered classics. Opened in 1948, the Comet was designed by Herbert Paul Schmeck and built by the Philadelphia Toboggan Company, or PTC, as a replacement for the park's infamous Cyclone roller coaster. Dr. Cartmell highlights the ride's then impressive height of 104 feet, and labels it the tallest steel coaster in the world, referring to its steel-supported track, which would make it a hybrid coaster by today's definition. Dr. Cartmell emphasizes how this ride is all hills and few turns, an accurate description of its unrelenting double out-and-back layout. In 1994, the coaster was packed up and moved to the Great Escape in Lake George, New York, where it still operates today. On Mitch Hawker's 2016 wooden coaster poll, the Comet ranked 41st in the world, a very respectable showing. In CoasterBot's poll from last year, the ride came in 326th amongst all coasters, a good deal higher than Lakeside Cyclone. Much like the Cyclone, however, the Comet had very low ridership, with it only appearing on 34 submitted ballots. Those who have ridden it praise its terrific airtime over its many bunny hills, a sensation that is highly favored amongst the modern-day coaster enthusiast circle, which could explain its high ranking. The Comet has also remained pretty smooth over the years, something that cannot be said for some of the other coasters on this list. That's back-to-back spots for Herbert Paul Schmeck and PTC, who designed and built Dorney Park's coaster in 1924, making it the oldest coaster on this list so far. Professor Cartmell focuses on this coaster's first drop, saying, quote, "Experienced riders continually cite the first drop on this coaster as one of their favorites, and that it's something like being pushed off of a cliff. These statements seem absurd today, given that Intamin and Rocky Mountain Construction are cranking out insane wooden coasters like these. But back in 1974, this slightly angled 65-foot drop must have been pretty thrilling. Today, the ride still operates as Thunderhawk. On Mitch Hawker's poll, the ride placed pretty poorly, coming in at 127th. It fared better in CoasterBot's poll, placing ahead of Lakeside Cyclone at 523rd. The ride has struggled with roughness over the years, and could certainly use a good retracking. Maybe 50 years ago was more rideable, but even 50 years ago, Thunderhawk was still nearly 50 years old, so maybe not. Make that 3 in a row for PTC, who built this landmark coaster in 1972, this time designed by John C. Allen. Opening just 2 years before Robert Cartmell's article was published, many consider the opening of this coaster to be the moment that kick-started the coaster boom of the 1970s and 80s. Professor Cartmell highlights the namesake racing element of the coaster, describing how the trains separate during the turnaround before sprinting along parallel tracks to the loading platform. He says that while the ride is fast and smooth, it's a great family ride, and claims to have seen 6-year-olds on it. While today's height requirement of 48 inches would make it difficult for a 6-year-old to ride, it's certainly passable as a family coaster at the park, despite being listed in the Thrill Ride section on Kings Island's website. In Mitch Hawker's poll, the racer placed in 96th, and on CoasterBot's poll, it landed in 440th. While certainly a fun ride, Racer's mild forces and straightforward layout prevent it from placing higher in modern coaster polls. Opening the same year as Thunderhawk at Dorney Park, Giant Dipper is one of the few remaining coasters built and designed by the legendary coaster-creating duo of Frank Pryor and Frederick Church. Located on a beachside boardwalk in Santa Cruz and featuring a strikingly iconic paint job, Professor Cartmell is right when he refers to this ride as, quote, one of the most beautiful coasters in the world. Featuring plenty of twisted drops and turns that came to define Pryor and Church's coasters, Dr. Cartmell describes the Giant Dipper as a most exciting ride, and modern thrill seekers seem to agree. In Mitch Hawker's poll, it placed a solid 51st, while in CoasterBot's, it finished an impressive 226th in the world. Perhaps it's the historical significance of riding one of the 3 remaining Pryor and Church coasters, or maybe it's the lateral forces and head choppers found throughout the ride. Even still, it may be the beachfront vibes, but this nearly 100-year-old coaster is still very highly regarded. Paragon Park's Giant Coaster arguably has the most interesting story of any coaster on this list. Technically the oldest coaster to earn a spot, having originally been designed by John A. Miller and PTC in 1917. Giant Coaster was eventually redesigned and partially rebuilt by Herbert Schmeck in 1932, after a fire destroyed portions of the original coaster. Dr. Cartmell highlights Giant Coaster's big stats, quoting its 98-foot height and, quote, worrisome total length of 3,200 feet. He also mentions how the train carries its speed well through the long layout, calling it, quote, extremely steep and fast. Paragon Park closed its doors in 1985, and Giant Coaster along with it. Thankfully, the ride was purchased that same year and relocated by Charles Dinn to Wild World in Maryland, now known today as Six Flags America, where it operates as Wild One. On Mitch's poll, Wild One came in 64th. In CoasterBot's poll, it's sitting at 400th. For a coaster originally built an insane 104 years ago, that's not bad at all. The ride suffers from the roughness issues you'd expect to find on a century-old coaster operating at a Six Flags park, but also features a very fun layout complete with airtime hills, a double down, and a unique helix finale, making Wild One a rickety yet enjoyable ride experience. Yet another PTC creation, this was the newest coaster on the list, having opened just a year prior to the article's publishing date. The ride is a classic example of a John C. Allen designed out-and-back Woody, and it was quite large for its time at 105 feet tall. Situated over a lagoon, the ride is quite beautiful, with Robert Cartmell adding that the ride's, quote, reflection in the nearby lagoon seems to add to the nightmarish height. The professor also stated that the ride is so smooth, you might think the tracks are waxed, a statement that did not age well at all, as the Great American Scream Machine is infamous today for its rough and bumpy ride experience. It comes as no surprise that Scream Machine lands in the middle of the pack, placing 84th in the Mitch Hawker poll and 485th in CoasterBot's poll. While incredibly rough, some may even say painfully rough, the ride's fun L-shaped layout and plentiful airtime moments push it higher up the list. Having ridden the ride during its first season when it still ran glass smooth, it's no surprise at all that Dr. Cartmell placed the Scream Machine in his top 4. Now, will Six Flags ever put in the track work to restore the ride to its former glory? I doubt it. I'd bet they go for a retheme or turn the train backwards or something before they ever think of, oh, they did? Six Flags. Arguably the most famous coaster ever built, Coney Island's Cyclone Coaster was designed by Vernon Keenan and built by Harry Baker towards the end of the Golden Age in 1927. Built on a tiny plot of land, the ride has a true twister layout that's been used as the blueprint for many modern-day coasters. Professor Cartmell called the ride Fast and Furious, and claimed that the first hill seems as close to a vertical drop as offered anywhere. This seems like another exaggerated statement about a wooden coaster's first drop, but then again, at 58.6 degrees, the Cyclone's first drop was very steep for its time. The Fast and Furious line certainly isn't exaggerated though, as the Cyclone hits a top speed of 60 miles an hour, and is filled with laterals and airtime moments. On Mitch Hawker's poll, the Coney Island Cyclone comes in at a surprisingly low 65th place, while on CoasterBot's poll, it comes in at 213th, the highest place so far. A truly iconic ride in a truly iconic setting, the Cyclone deserves a spot on any classic coaster list. No coaster top 10 list is without its controversial picks. While its placement of second on the list may come off as a bit surprising, the fact that La Montaña Rusa made Professor Cartmell's list at all isn't entirely surprising. Constructed by National Amusement Device in 1964, the ride was the tallest coaster in the world at the time, standing 110 feet tall. Not only that, but La Montaña Rusa is a rare Mobius loop coaster, or a racing coaster built as one continuous track, unlike a traditional racing coaster which has two separate tracks set side by side. Dr. Cartmell writes about the immense scale of this wooden beast, talking about its height, track length, and absurd capacity of 96 passengers per trip between both trains. Dr. Cartmell fails to mention anything about the actual ride experience, something that falls flat in recent history. On Mitch Hawker's poll, the ride placed a dismal 108th. Unfortunately, the coaster has been standing but not operating since 2019, and was not on CoasterBot's 2020 poll, although I doubt it would place very high. The drops are shallow, the turns long, drawn out, and rough, and its once record-breaking height now appears less intimidating compared to modern wooden coasters. However, the ride's racing element is always a plus, with bonus points for it being a Mobius loop coaster. It must have seemed absolutely massive back when this list was made. Unfortunately, the park announced that it will be removing this historic ride as part of a multi-year redevelopment plan, making La Montaña Rusa the only coaster on this list to not be operating today. Before we check out Robert Cartmell's number 1 coaster, let's take a look at the rides that surprisingly didn't make his list. Herbert Schmeck and PTC's 1946 creation was left off this list, despite being a well-regarded out-and-back coaster, certainly more well-regarded than the Schmeck-designed and number 8 placing Thunderhawk. The roller coaster capital of the world was left off of Robert Cartmell's list, including their oldest operating coaster, the John C. Allen-designed Blue Streak. On the CoasterBot poll ranking, it would have come in just behind the Great Escapes Comet, good for a top 5 position, and placed solidly in the middle of the Mitch Hawker rankings. Built all the way back in 1920, John Miller and PTC's Jackrabbit is still placing relatively high on coaster polls, mostly because of its insane double down that produces aggressive ejector airtime. Professor Cartmell seemed to be more interested in the overall ride experience and seemed to favor coasters with unique settings and layouts as opposed to which produced the best airtime, as seen in his pick for number 1, which we'll get to shortly. Jackrabbit would have placed in the 5th position on Mitch Hawker's ranking, and the 4th position on CoasterBot's poll. Constructed in 1958 at Vancouver's Playland Park, coaster is famous for its airtime and single-position buzz bars, which makes its ridiculous airtime moments all the more terrifying. Honestly, I bet there's a good chance that Robert Cartmell hadn't ridden coaster by the time he made this list. Tucked away in the northwest corner of North America, the ride is not very easy to get to. Coaster would have topped Mitch Hawker's list, and placed in the top 3 on CoasterBot's. Here it is, the ride that has truly stood the test of time. Designed by Herbert Schmeck and opened in 1948, the ride operated as Rocket at Playland Park in San Antonio, Texas until 1980, when Playland Park shut its doors. 5 years later in 1985, the coaster was carefully taken apart and shipped to Knoebels in Pennsylvania, where it was reborn as the Phoenix. Maybe Robert Cartmell never rode it when it operated in Texas, or perhaps it wasn't running nearly as well prior to its relocation. But today, the Phoenix is considered to be one of the best wooden roller coasters in the world. It would have easily taken the first spot in both the Mitch Hawker and CoasterBot rankings, with CoasterBot's poll ranking the Phoenix as the 9th best wooden coaster and the 46th best overall coaster operating today. Now, for Robert Cartmell's number 1 coaster. Here it is, the ultimate coaster, at least according to Robert Cartmell in 1974. Originally designed by John Miller and PTC, Kennywood's Thunderbolt opened as the Pippin in 1924, a coaster that took place entirely in and around a ravine. In 1968, designer Andy Vettel and the firm National Amusement Device came in and completely redesigned the ride, incorporating a new section of twisted drops and turns into the already existing ravine section of the Pippin. The final product is a coaster that utilizes its terrain very well, something Professor Cartmell really seemed to love. In his review, he talks about the Thunderbolt's immediate plummet from the loading platform, as well as its sudden 90-foot drop to close out the ride. Talking about this final drop, Cartmell says, "A hill like this at the end of a ride is unthinkable, unfair, but it's just one of the joys to be experienced on this king of coasters." Cartmell also has high praise for the new section of the ride built by Vettel, adding that the bruising turns disorient riders, making the plunge into the valley all the more thrilling. The ride still holds up really well today, with its heavy use of hilly terrain and crushing lateral forces being as unique as they were 50 years ago. On Mitch Hawker's poll, the Thunderbolt came in 56th, good for a 3rd place in this ranking. As for CoasterBot's poll, Thunderbolt also came in 3rd place, coming in at 261st on the list, thus giving us our final results. So what opinions have held up over time? Compared to just these rides, Wild One has remained in the middle of the pack across all 3 polls. Thunderbolt seems to earn its nickname as the King of Coasters, being the only ride to place in the top 3 in each poll. Thunderhawk, on the other hand, earns the opposite distinction, being the only ride to place in the bottom 3 across all 3 polls. Racer maintained a relatively constant mediocre position over time as well. There are also a few notable discrepancies looking at these lists, the most glaring one being La Montaña Rusa, which jumped from 2nd place in the 1974 poll to 2nd to last in Mitch Hawker's poll. Modern enthusiasts hold the Great Escapes Comet to a much higher opinion than Dr. Cartmell, with it landing in the 1st place position in Mitch Hawker's poll. The Giant Dipper has also seen a positive sway in opinion over time, placing 2nd in both of the modern day polls. And now that the Great American Scream Machine is far from being glass smooth, it's dropped from being a top 4 coaster to a consistent bottom 4. It's also worth mentioning the interesting positioning of the 2 Cyclone coasters in Mitch Hawker's poll. Having placed in the top 3 in the 2 other lists, Luna Park Cyclone didn't even make the top 5, and instead of appearing towards the bottom, Lakeside Cyclone is sitting comfortably in the number 4 spot. Why? As for Lakemont Cyclone, I think it relates back to what I mentioned earlier about the difficulties of accurately ranking a coaster that was on so few ballots, resulting in its drastic difference in placement between 2013 and 2020. As for the Coney Island Cyclone, the ride received an extensive, multi-year, phased retracking by Great Coasters International beginning in 2012. Many of the people who submitted ballots to Mitch Hawker's 2013 poll likely rode the Cyclone before this retracking began, and certainly before it was completed. Clearly the work done to the ride has improved the ride experience, as it fared much better in the 2020 poll. Hopefully the parks operating these classic coasters will continue to invest in and care for them, ensuring that they remain on coaster lists like these for years to come. Sadly, Robert Cartmell passed away in 2018. While he may be gone, his passion for roller coasters lives on today in the community of enthusiasts that share his love for these amazing rides, and who continue to embark on their own quest for the ultimate coaster. Thanks for watching.